All right. All right. Well, thank you, Mustafa and Miku, for inviting me. I didn't know I was the premier guest speaker,
You are
but that's
now.
okay. So today I'm going to talk about online queue sorting in light of a worldwide pandemic, and I'll fill in a little bit of what Mustafa said, and also, of course, talk about the connection between physics and Q methodology. I'm sure that there won't be too much of a surprise. I just like this picture, so I wanted it to be in part one of my slides. So a little background about me. See if I can move this thing out of the way. I think it's usually, there we go. So I actually started off being an industrial physicist. Ironically, I ended up turning into an academic, even though as an undergrad and grad student, people would ask me, a physics major, like, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to teach? I'd say, no, I'm not going to teach. I am going to be an industrial physicist. And I was for 7 years. And I made radiation detectors and grew crystals and did all kinds of groovy things. And then an opportunity came up at the University of Akron, and I turned into an academic. I hadn't completed my dissertation, and since I was then at a university and I could get my dissertation done basically for free while working full-time and having 3 children, because that seemed like a good idea, I did that. My dissertation is actually focused on science and physics education. It was incredibly quantitative. In fact, at the time, I had to do some qualitative stuff to please members of my committee, and I remember being just a little aggravated about that because I was really into the quantitative part. I used R factor analysis to do content validity of an instrument called the Force and Motion Conceptual Evaluation. I also did estimates of reliability. I used linear regression, holding certain things constant while investigating impact of different things in physics labs on conceptual understanding in physics. And I really thought that that was kind of the direction I was going to go in. I was already pretty excited about quantitative research focused on physics education. And I completed my dissertation actually in December. I graduated in December 2003. And then literally that spring I went to a conference and was introduced to Q. That was 2004. Ran into actually somebody who had been a grad student friend of mine, and he had gone to Steve Brown's summer workshop. I don't even know how he ended up there, but he introduced me to the general idea of Q, and I literally caught the Q bug. And then I started seeing Q studies pretty much everywhere, and I can't seem to stop. I did actually a keynote for the Ohio section of the American Association of Physics Teachers just 2 days ago on Saturday, and I told them I was addicted to research, and I really think I am. Uh, but until the pandemic, all of my studies were face-to-face, or at least hard copies of sorting. I had had conversations with Steve Brown. My friend who had introduced me to Q was going to end up doing a Q dissertation, and the goal was to do online Q sorting. So I had numerous conversations with Steve Brown back then about online Q sorting. And so I was interested in it and kind of hesitant about using it. But then there was COVID, and online was the only option. So I went online all the way. So more background. My little thing doesn't want to click. There we go. So my first Q conference was in Athens, Georgia. And that's when I first learned that William Stephenson was a physicist as well as a psychologist. And it was Byung Lee who is attending today. We were going on a bus trip. I don't even remember where we were going. And all I know is I got on the bus, which looked kind of like this bus, and I happened to sit next to Byung Lee, and he was talking to me, and he asked me basically what discipline I taught in at the University of Akron, and I said physics, and he got real excited, which usually isn't what happens when you tell people that you're a physicist or you're a physics professor. Usually that it's the opposite. And so Byung was the first person to tell me that William Stephenson was also a physicist, and somehow I had missed that in my quick reading, mostly of the Little Sage book by McCune and Thomas, the 1988 version. I had read it twice that summer, but I don't think anywhere in there that it said that Stephenson was a physicist. So that got me even more excited. At that same conference, I ended up talking to Amanda Wolf, who was then editor of Operant Subjectivity, and we had a conversation walking somewhere in Athens, Georgia, and that led me to actually writing my very first Operant Subjectivity article, which was about a physicist reflects on Q methodology and physics or something to that effect. Anyway, so Q methodology, incredibly connected to physics. I've recently got another journal article accepted that talks about Q methodology's connections to physics. I seem to be very, we'll call obsessed with this right now. So Q's creator, William Stephenson, had PhDs in both physics and psychology. At the time, in the 30s and 40s, there was this emerging idea of something they called psychophysics, which was essentially to take ideas from physics and new emerging fields in physics like quantum physics and bring those ideas to psychology. And William Stephenson was very interested in this, and that's how he ended up working with Spearman. And of course, the mathematics of factor analysis are actually exactly the same as the mathematics of quantum mechanics or quantum physics. Back in my education, grad student days, taking advanced statistics, that's when I first learned about factor analysis, our factor analysis, in fact. And I remember I got so excited because Isidore Newman, who's also my good advisor guy, started describing and having us calculate by hand these factors, and I like literally stood up and I was so excited. It's like, this is exactly the same as the mathematics and quantum physics. And one of the grad students who was sitting next to me turned to me and looked at me and said, "Why are you in our class?" But Stephenson understood that the mathematics was the same, but he went beyond that, and he actually integrated ideas from quantum physics, including complementarity, within Q. So, and then incorporated lots of philosophy of science. So if you read much Stephenson, he'll talk a lot about quantum. Mostly later on, he didn't talk about quantum physics very much in the study of behavior, but certainly once he hit the 1980s, he has a number of articles tying Q and quantum together. So one of my suggestions is you should read Stephenson. And when I wrote this, I thought, well, I should probably say read and reread Stephenson, because he writes very much like a physicist, and so things are a little thick, and it takes often a couple of readings. I've read the study of behavior twice now, and then there are certain sections that I've reread, I don't even know how many times. I've lost track. But one of my favorite quotes of Stephenson in that text is that he said, "Q is a new house built from old bricks." And literally, I found a picture on the internet that is a house built from old bricks, just so I could quote that. But that's why Stephenson drew on things like quantum physics and talked a lot about philosophy of science and integrated these ideas into Q methodology. That's what he meant by a new house built from old bricks. So let's talk about Q sorting a little bit. So Stevenson talked about Q technique, which is the sorting aspect of the larger methodology. He said it brought quantum theory to subjectivity, and that it also offered a new way to measure everything subjective. And I have to say that the whole Q sorting thing is just, it is so cool. It makes so much sense to me. And one of the reasons it makes so much sense to me, and how I got hooked into Q so quickly, was that when my friend Joe introduced me to Q, he said when he first learned about Q that he thought of me because I was always complaining about how all the things statistically and all the bias in student evaluation and of teaching made no sense to me, and that, you know, you could agree with everything, and that didn't seem like that made a lot of sense. And certainly, right, that's one of the greatest things about Q, is the ability to sort these items and capture a viewpoint. But I've often wondered what Stevenson would say about online Q sorting or Q technique. So I want to kind of step forward and then look at what has happened over the years with Q method, which is the factor analytical part of our larger methodology. So initially, factor analysis, right, in Q and in R and in quantum mechanics was all done by hand. Before there were computers, when I was in graduate school, all of our quantum mechanical calculations were all done by hand. It was a lot of fun. And then there were mainframe computers, and a guy at Kent State, John Atkinson, wrote the first computer program to do the analyses in Q, right, including creating all those wonderful tables that are so important to us. And that was called Q method. And then Peter Schmalk took that code and put it into, right, basically a Fortran program that worked on DOS-based personal computers. When I first started doing Q, and pretty much up until the pandemic, I used PQ method for all of my analyses. DOS never scared me. I still remembered, even when I first started using PQ method, still knew all my DOS commands because I'm old. There were also a Windows version, PCQ, created by Mike Strickland, that was created for Windows, and he gives that program away. And now today there are more what I'll call modern Q programs, like KenQ by Sean Banasic, which is what I've been using now. And KenQ is web-based, right? So it doesn't matter what computer platform you're using. It doesn't matter if you have a Mac or a PC, or, right, you're running Unix. You could run anything, and, right, as long as you have a browser, you can use KenQ. And you can input data directly from HTMLQ, which is what I've been doing, but you can also upload Excel files and files from PQ method. And so we can see that there's been this kind of, right, trajectory for technology going from hand calculations to mainframes to old personal computers with DOS. Even if you use PQ method now, it's still, right, that's why you need DOS box and things like that, and now, so KenQ. So we can see this evolution. And so I'm thinking that, you know, in a lot of ways, the move to online sorting is very much like the move from hand calculations to computer calculations in the Q method part. So for Q technique, did we just need to wait for the technology to catch up to both do it and do it well, which then got my nerd brain thinking that I could just create this function. It's a Q function, and it's based on time, you see, right? So Q sort online, right? Visualization, technology, and access. So to me, these are the key aspects, right, of sorting online. For the longest time, I didn't sort online, and I'll talk about that a bit. But from the very beginning, right, I started off pretty much with local participants. I would say that my students every semester, they were my guinea pigs. And so I would create my concourse and then select my statements. I do all my coding and everything in Microsoft Excel. I love Excel. Early on, when Jack Block was still alive and on the Q list, somebody asked a question about how they did the printouts, right, the cards for a Q sort. And a lot of people actually printed out labels and put them on, literally put them on cards. And I stated that I just did it all in Excel, and then I could randomly arrange my statements in Excel, and then I could make all the cells the same size and create numbered lists. And right, it made it really easy to do the little slice and dice, literally, with one of these things. The one that I used looks just like this, except it's green and very ancient. And Jack Block actually wrote that I was brilliant in an email, which I still have, because Jack Block said that was like so brilliant. So I was like, must keep that. Anyway, so usually I did it with a classroom of students, so they would all do the sorts all at the same time. And I would walk around and answer questions, but pretty much they were on their own, right? And I didn't interview them. They wrote responses to prompts about what they thought about the sorting process, why they placed their statements at +5, why they placed these other statements at -5. My first published study, was actually for a committee that I was in charge of. It was the creation of a School of Technology committee, and there was a great deal of yelling in that committee because there were some really seemingly divergent opinions, and I used Q not only to figure out what the opinions were, which was very interesting because the two loudest people they were the only two people on the same factor, but it was bipolar. And then everybody else was on one or two other factors, but we used consensus statements and managed to go through and create our white paper for the School of Technology. And then, of course, the administration changed and that all went away, but still. I also did a study with caregivers that were part of a professional development workshop. They were also all in one room, right, sorting together. They were, unlike my students, talk out loud kind of people and discuss things. So that was very interesting. Of course, they were older adults, but they were caregivers, and they had a lot in common. So, and then I also had done Q sorts one-on-one, but these were all, again, local participants. They were all paper. I learned important things, like when you have a white tile floor in your classroom, you should put your Q sort items on colored paper so that if they drop it, they can see that they dropped it. I liked yellow. And then I entered everything into PQ method. That wasn't always perfect because there were problems like people not writing all the numbers in the boxes, or I couldn't read their handwriting. So was that a 5 or a 6? Not always easy to tell. And then I did some studies with non-local participants. At that time, I had thought about doing an online sort, but I had constantly, every time somebody offered up an online Q sort, usually on the Q list, I always volunteered to do it. And I was really lukewarm about the process. It just was hard to really see all of the statements. It was difficult to go and really feel connected to the different items and really compare them. And so for my non-local participants, I emailed them the Q sample and they got to cut them up. and they would print out everything, cut up their little statements with scissors, and then either scan in, their results or snail mail them to me. And then again, I entered all the data by hand into PQ method, right? And we can see my little example of Q items. And then there was COVID. And then I had so many new questions to answer, but there was no way logistically to do what I had done in the past and email people these statements and a form. And also I needed to find a pretty diverse P set. And so I had my first 3 online studies, and they were all about COVID. COVID led me to ask a lot of questions. I like questions. I always have questions. But for all 3 of these, I needed, like I said, I needed a broader P set, right? And although I did a little bit of snowballing to recruit participants, I knew that wasn't going to be enough. And certainly having people, right, I would have to, if I emailed them, right, then they would not be able to easily ship them back to me anyway, and I didn't really want to handle people's paper, so I knew the Q sorts had to be all done online. And I chose HTML-Q. I had met Sean Banisic, and I had looked at KenQ before, and so I was looking at KenQ, and he had HTML-Q and a PowerPoint that was slightly out of date, but talked about the steps to go through, and so that's what I did. I used HTML-Q, and these are the 3 studies. So 2 of them are now published, and I'll talk about each one of these. So one is about students' views about emergency remote instruction. Another one is about faculty viewpoints about universities moving online. And then the third one was about how to address the financial impact. And that one happens to still be in review. Been having a hard time having it find a home. So like I said, I selected HTML-Q, and this is basically what a completed sort looks like for HTML-Q. It's set up that when you actually participate, right, you put statements into one of 3 piles, just like I would have people do with paper, and we can actually see what that looks like. So these green statements here would be the statements this sorter put in the agree pile. The pink ones that you see here, those were originally placed in the disagree pile, so not like my view. And then these kind of gray ones, these were the items that were in the neutral pile. And then literally, right, you can go through the same kind of process that you would in person with paper, right? So then you can go through and you can see the list of items that are in the agree pile, and you can move them into the most agree with in the +5 and the next one, and you can easily move them around. In this version of HTML-Q, you can't necessarily see the entire sentence, and some of my sentences were rather long, although I'm not a fan of multiple sentences, so they're each one sentence, and pretty much they came from this one happens to be let's see, this one was the one for the student views. So I literally had been listening to students and talking to them, and so most of these statements came from the things students actually said, pretty much how they said it. So we'll start off, I'll talk a little bit about the student views about emergency remote instruction thanks to COVID-19. So as we know, about halfway through the semester, at least in the US, right, students were these students all were in face-to-face classes, and then March happened, basically March 10th, and everything moved online. And so it was literally emergency remote instruction. So to recruit participants, I sent a link to the study's website, which is how HTML-Q is set up. You literally, you set up the files and then you upload them into what's really an online database system that stores your information, and then you host it on a free host site. And so the link is to the host site, which is free. So I also liked all this stuff because it was free. So I sent links to students and faculty friends who were not at the University of Akron in an attempt to get a pretty broad sample of students. So I didn't want everybody just to be, for instance, from the University of Akron. And I managed to do that. So I ended up with 92 completed sorts, which was the biggest Q study I'd ever done. And I was really excited that I didn't have to enter 92 completed Q sorts into PQ method. The analyses using CanQ were really straightforward. There's no typing things in, right? There's no way for participants to accidentally use number 15 twice in two very different places. So you don't have to throw out Q sorts or try to interpret what they were thinking. And then students, right, also were set up so that they had to comment on their sorts. So why they put the two statements at +5, why they put the two statements at -5, and their overall thoughts about the sorting process. And I'll talk a little bit about gathering that information here in a bit. But 3 student viewpoints emerged. So the first one was, it is what it is. So these students weren't necessarily excited about taking online classes, right? But they accepted that this was just the way it was going to be. They really missed their face-to-face interactions with instructors and tutors and peers and advisors, and they missed hands-on learning experiences. This was especially true for students in art and in science, technology, and engineering fields. Then there was a view, I hate online classes. So these students retained their prior negative view of online coursework. A number of them commented that they had taken online classes before, hated them, still hated them, thank you. And then there was a smaller group, and I called them the loners, and they really preferred online instruction to face-to-face instruction because they really didn't want to talk to anybody. They wanted to do the work, get it done, and not have to talk to people. They really didn't want to interact with instructors, tutors, peers, etc. Then we have the faculty's version of moving online. And in this case, there are 2 social media pages on Facebook. So one of them is called Pandemic Pedagogy, and the other one is called Higher Ed and the Coronavirus. And these seemed like the perfect place to post the link and ask people to participate in my study. And so I did that, and it was very interesting. I had 78 completed Q sorts. 44% of those identified themselves as tenured faculty. 67% were female, and I found that rather surprising. And I think that it was a function of recruiting on Facebook. I hadn't really thought about it at the time, but the reality is that a lot of the people who were on these 2 pages and posting and commenting regularly were women who wanted to talk a lot about their experiences. So I guess I shouldn't have been surprised at the heavier female representation. There happened to be 3 views in this study as well. One of them was techies who like to teach. They really like educational technology. They aren't afraid of teaching online. They probably had the most positive view of teaching online. although they didn't think that online was the panacea of all things that ills higher ed. Then there were the overwhelmed as human beings. So these faculty were also in roles of being a caregiver. So it was predominantly female, but not 100% female. They were caring for young children who now were not in school. They were trying to convert their face-to-face classes to online. They were caregiving for older adults. There was one person who felt that they were caregiving for the world, and they were so overwhelmed by the pandemic itself that they felt they had to take care of themselves, that they were so overwhelmed with the thought of so many people dying. There were a couple of faculty who had turned into caregivers of their students, and they were very overwhelmed with the needs of students, whether it was technology or just issues related to the coronavirus. And that one, I think, helps us remember, or hopefully, and especially for administrators, that the faculty are human beings and they have other things that affect their world and their teaching besides just the university. Then it was it's about what cannot be done online. So these faculty were most focused on the limitations of technology and what they could do as online instruction. So a lot of these faculty were, again, art, science, engineering. So they were very concerned about how to translate labs, for instance, to online and still have them be meaningful rather than just kind of a walk-through, check-a-box kind of experience. Overall, the consensus, which I thought this was very important, that faculty felt very frustrated across these three views, and even those who didn't end up on a factor, with their ability to best support their students within the online format. And I think that really was insightful, especially for me. I was glad I wasn't alone, for one thing. And then this third study is about how to address the financial impact. I decided to do this study because the University of Akron was already talking. I started planning this actually before they declared force majeure, meaning that the pandemic had impacted the institution, they said, such that they were going to have to take some drastic measures. But it seemed more and more, as I read about universities' reactions to the pandemic, that there was going to be a crisis of some kind, not just financial, but one that would affect academic freedom and faculty and tenure. And it just seemed so much that trustees were out of step maybe with the rest of the universities. And so I wanted to investigate that because I always have so many questions. So I, again, recruited participants via social media. I went back to pandemic pedagogy and higher ed and the coronavirus. This was the last really of the three. I had the student and faculty parts of the study going earlier, and they kind of coexisted. And then this one was just a little behind that. And it was very interesting, some of the things that people wrote in their comments especially. So for this study, 66% identified as tenured faculty, and even more women participated. So this study, 76% were women. There were 83 completed Q sorts, and there were 3 views that emerged. One was that we should focus on the teaching mission and students, and that should be where we should go as far as the pandemic and the financial impact. That if we focused on the teaching mission and our students, especially retaining our students, that this was the best path to go down. The second view was the university as a business. And it was interesting. This had a couple of faculty on it, but pretty much they were staff and administrators, and I believe a couple of community members were on this factor. So they saw the university should run itself like a business, and their decisions about what was best, the best paths to follow, were focused in that kind of paradigm. And then finally was the third view. They saw the university as a community, and so they were very focused on having all voices heard, that they felt that really this was the time for things like shared governance, to hear everybody's ideas and work together rather than have trustees who tend to be businessmen make decisions. Overall, the consensus was that all three views, including the university as a business view, rejected the idea of cutting faculty, cutting staff, and cutting programs. They saw this as the opposite of what universities should do. So very interesting that in the end, most universities cut faculty, cut staff, and cut programs, although that certainly wasn't the only thing that universities did. For instance, a neighboring university, Cleveland State, actually created an incentive that if students were successful, for instance, this fall 2020 semester, then they would get like 50% off their tuition for spring. So there were really some novel approaches to addressing the financial impact, but overall, not the kinds of things that these faculty, administrators, staff, and community members thought were the direction to go in. I have to say, I agree, and not just because I was a faculty laid off supposedly because of the pandemic. But I want to focus on some online Q-sort takeaways, right? I once again love the fact that there was no data entry into PQ method. The only data entry, right, was that I had to copy and paste written comments from the JSON file. The JSON file, which is created as part of the HTML-Q packet, has in it what's basically the results of the sorting, but then you can have demographic questions and written comments, and you just have to remember basically how you coded, right, certain questions, and then, right, it just becomes a copy and paste. I just copied and pasted basically into an Excel spreadsheet, and that was much easier again than typing, which is what I normally would have done from hand hard copies or scanned in versions of, right, the sheets that I normally would have used. It was so easy to recruit people. I can't lie, that was really nice. I don't believe that you often have to have a lot of Q sorters. Most of my studies are somewhere between 20 and 40 participants at the most, and I've certainly had studies where there were fewer, but it was really nice to be able to have a really diverse P set. So I can't stress enough how easy it was to get people to participate. And then one of the big things that I thought was important was that I recruited some of my usual suspects. So for both students and faculty, and they had participated in my paper sort studies in the past. And a number of them, I don't really know which ones they were because it was all anonymous, but they wrote down in their reflection on the sorting process how much more they enjoyed doing it online. They felt it was easier to interact with the items. So I thought that was really important, because that was always my concern about sorting online, was participants' ability to really interact and reflect on the items. And the general, I didn't have anybody who said that they'd rather do paper sorts. I had participants who said, please don't ever do paper sorts again. Please only do it online. I enjoyed this so much better. I will also say that I am really glad that I teach/know C programming because of HTML/Q. It's not C, it's HTML, but they're all kind of in the same happy family as well as Java, right? They're all kind of variations of Q. So it was pretty easy for me to figure out some of the quirky things, problems that I ran into. I did talk to Sean Banasek at one point because I had followed his instructions for having Firefox test drive my setup, and it didn't work, and ended up, after we emailed back and forth a little bit, that Firefox had made an update. And when they updated Firefox, it screwed it up, this ability to kind of preview the study before uploading it into the database manager and then the web host. And so I had to go in and fix some things. And I actually documented all that. If you watch the videos on YouTube, I show you how to do some of those things. But now it's not as important. This is for those of you who haven't used HTML/Q. The version that I used was the original, basically, version based on Flash Q, except it doesn't use Flash. It uses HTML because Flash is no longer supported by browsers. But this is basically what some of the files look like. So this is the config file, and I don't remember which one. Oh, this is the setup for the Q sort. It's an XML file, and you can see basically what it looks like. This one isn't so interesting. All these double slashes, this is all comments. Double slashes just mean it's a comment, just like in C. And then you can go in and literally you could go in and, right, find, in this case, right, your study title and just whatever was in the original version of HTML/Q, I put in this, right, and then you can change some things I haven't done. For instance, I didn't use passwords, but now the good news is, which I can't really comment on because I haven't gotten. This is one of my goals for spring break, is to not only download the Easy HTML/Q version 2 that Sean Banasek recently shared with the Q list, but to figure out how it works. So from what I can tell, because it uses this EQ configurator, it's going to be not so C HTML/Q programming like, and it should be easier for people who don't look at the code and kind of freak out. I will say that I was relatively recently, the third author of a study that had to move online, and I got to be third author because I was the online Q sort person. But that was fun because it was a project that otherwise I wouldn't have been involved with. So, of course, I'm still always thinking about Q and future research. So I want to look at some other studies. They'll also be online. One of them is reduction in forced faculty views, not just the 100 or so faculty from the University of Akron that were cut, but also other faculty. Places like Ohio University cut a lot of their contingent faculty, but not their tenured faculty like Akron. There have been a number of other places. Otterbein laid off a physics faculty member and another faculty person who were tenured. So I'd like to kind of target those people about how this has impacted them personally and professionally. I think that would be kind of an amazing story. There'll be probably Friday of this week or Monday next week a series of articles that are going to come out in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I happen to be one of the stories, but talking to the journalists at the Chronicle, as I have since January, as well as my group of RIF faculty from the University of Akron that I have all gathered together. I think that this would be really interesting. The other thing I want to look at is now that we're a year into the pandemic and we've been teaching online, even though I did teach some face-to-face this semester, how views of teaching online may have changed. I think about that a lot because my views of teaching online have changed. I taught online before I actually taught a Q workshop online way back in like 2010 or 2012. Now there are a lot of advances. Certainly the pandemic pushed us to become more technologically aware of our options, things like breakout rooms and polling software that are a part of things like WebEx and Zoom. And then also, once I play around with HTML-Q 2.0, I'm hoping to also update my YouTube channel to have instructional videos for using that. I have the feeling, again, that it'll be much easier than HTML-Q 1.0. But I'm hoping that that will be something that that I can get up on YouTube. I know that from people who contact me from all over the world, but people like those videos, so I want to keep them up to date as much as possible. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ramlo. This was exciting and educational.
Oh, thanks.
So we have about 10 minutes, and we thought that it would be a good idea to have some questions and comments to you or just anyone in the group.
Sure.
Definitely, and it has been interesting to see. You know, I think it's going to be an exciting